The winter sea possessed an almost supernatural ability to silence everything around it. High above the water's surface, a crescent moon hung like a pale sentinel, casting its thin ribbon of silver light across the endless Pacific waves. Each rolling swell climbed toward the sky before surrendering to gravity's pull. The rhythm felt ancient, timeless, completely removed from the massive global conflict that was tearing apart nations and continents. Only the wind made any sound at all. Even that came as barely more than a whisper. Any Japanese sailor keeping watch on the deck of a destroyer, cutting through those waters, might have found the scene almost peaceful, deceptively calm. But somewhere beneath that glittering surface of moonlit ocean, death was prowling. The hunter was USS Archerfish. She belonged to the Balao class of American submarines. 311 feet of welded steel plates painted in wartime gray. When she rose to the surface, her conning tower appeared as nothing more than a dark silhouette against the moon-washed sea. When she slipped beneath the waves, only her periscope and radar mast broke the waterline. Inside her pressure hull, the air hung thick and oppressive, oil fumes mixed with human sweat. The constant smell of machinery filled every compartment. Crew members moved with practiced quiet around banks of valves and gauges. They bent over plotting tables covered in grease pencil marks. Their voices stayed low. Their concentration never wavered. These men had been fighting this war for years now. Yet something about this particular night felt different. Something enormous was building. At the heart of it all stood Commander Joseph F. Enright. Enright was 33 years old. Dark eyes reflected the weight of command. His reputation had been shaky until recently. He carried the burden of previous failure like a stone in his chest. During an earlier patrol, he had commanded another submarine. When the moment came to attack, he had hesitated. Crucial seconds had slipped away. He had returned to port without firing a single torpedo. For a submarine commander in wartime, such a patrol represented more than disappointment. It was shame. Deep, personal shame. Enright had actually requested to be relieved of duty. He felt his instincts had abandoned him when they mattered most. That scar influenced every decision he made now. Tonight, somewhere in the black waters south of Honshu, he meant to erase that failure completely. Enright positioned himself at the periscope. One hand rested lightly on the control grip. His other hand fingered a rosary hidden in his pocket. He was a Catholic man, not outwardly religious in any obvious way, but those beads provided comfort when the weight of responsibility pressed down on him, and responsibility felt crushing tonight. Somewhere to the north, beyond the dark headlands of Tokyo Bay, an enormous Japanese vessel was moving through the water. The radar operator had detected it first. Just a blip on the screen. 12 miles away. Holding steady on a southwest course. The contact appeared massive, unmistakably large. Enright knew in his gut that this was no ordinary merchant ship. The question that burned in his mind was simple. What exactly was it? Earlier in the evening, Archerfish had been assigned lifeguard duty. She was supposed to wait in position to rescue any American airmen shot down during bombing raids. Those raids never materialized. Now free to hunt, she had stumbled across what might be an incredible prize. Nobody aboard yet understood the true magnitude of what lay ahead. Enright's thoughts turned to Japan's great battleships. The massive Yamato and her sister Musashi. These were floating fortresses that had dominated headlines. Musashi had been destroyed at Leyte Gulf just weeks earlier. Wave after wave of American bombers had pounded her until she rolled over and sank. Could this contact be Yamato herself finally venturing out? Or was this something even more significant? Something completely new? The submarine trembled slightly as she adjusted her heading. Inside the control room, men hunched over the plotting board. They traced lines showing relative motion between the boats. Grease pencils marked bearings and course changes. They worked with quiet urgency, Everyone understood that timing and geometry determined whether they lived or died. One mistake would not only lose the target, it could bring destroyers racing down on them with depth charges. For now, Archerfish maintained her distance. She shadowed the contact on the surface. Darkness provided concealment. Thin clouds drifting across the moon gave additional cover. Inside the submarine, life continued with tense discipline. The crew had long ago adapted to cramped quarters. Torpedo men slept on cots wedged between their weapons in the forward compartment. Officers shared bunks in rotating shifts. Every man knew his battle station by pure instinct. The air carried constant background noise. Fans hummed. Pumps cycled. The low rumble of diesel engines vibrated through the hull when running on the surface. Men wore sweat-stained khaki uniforms. Some had stripped down to undershirts in the muggy compartments below. On nights like this, heightened nerves amplified every sound. The creak of steel plates as sea pressure pushed against the hull. The slap of waves breaking against the bow. The faint electronic buzz emanating from the radar screen. Expectation magnified each noise. Enright was determined not to let expectation turn into hesitation again. He had made that resolution months earlier during a poker game at Midway Naval Base. A senior officer had watched his aggressive betting and bluffing. The man had asked him a direct question. "Joe, would you command a submarine the same way you play cards?" Enright's answer had been immediate and simple. Yes. That single word had earned him another chance at command. Now, standing at the periscope, that chance was about to face its ultimate test. What Enright could not possibly know was the incredible scale of what moved through the darkness ahead. The ship he was stalking was Shinano. She was the pride of Japanese shipbuilding. At 71,890 tons fully loaded, she was the largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. She had been completed in absolute secrecy. Her commissioning had taken place only days earlier. Now she steamed through the night with a skeleton crew and unfinished systems. She was supposed to represent strength, defiance. Instead, she was sailing unknowingly toward a single submarine. That submarine was commanded by a man who needed redemption as desperately as the Japanese Navy needed a miracle. The moon disappeared briefly behind a veil of drifting clouds. The horizon went completely dark. In that moment, the men aboard Archerfish felt the ocean grow even quieter, as though the sea itself was holding its breath. Enright leaned forward into the periscope eyepiece once more. The silhouette remained faint, but definitely there. It loomed against the darkness. He could make out the escorts now, darker shapes cutting through the water around the main vessel. One destroyer suddenly turned sharply. It raced directly toward their position. For a terrifying instant, it seemed the hunter had become the hunted. Then, inexplicably, the destroyer veered away. It wheeled back around and resumed its station alongside the convoy. The opportunity remained alive. Enright spoke quietly to his officers. His voice stayed calm but carried absolute determination. "Stay with her. Let her zigzag. We'll find where she straightens out." His words contained more than just tactical orders. They carried a personal promise to himself, to his crew, to his career. He would not hesitate this time. He would trust his instincts completely. He would strike when the moment came. The clock moved steadily toward midnight. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, the largest warship in history continued through the night. She had no idea that beneath the calm surface, a submarine and her determined captain had locked her in their crosshairs. The stage was perfectly set. The deadly game of patience, geometry, and fate had officially begun. The year was 1944. The tide of the Second World War had shifted with undeniable force. For Japan, the empire that had once stretched from the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Burma, the war was no longer about conquest. It had become a desperate struggle for survival. The empire now fought purely on the defensive, battered from the air, strangled at sea, bleeding from wounds in its outer island fortresses. The Pacific Ocean was no longer a vast protective moat surrounding the Japanese home islands. It had transformed into a battlefield that shrank with each passing month. American forces had executed their island-hopping campaign with relentless precision. The Solomons had fallen. Then the Gilberts. The Marshalls followed. Finally, the Marianas. Each successful landing brought United States forces closer to Japan's heart. With every amphibious assault, the Japanese military found itself fighting from increasingly weaker positions. Resources were stretched impossibly thin. Morale was sinking like a damaged ship. By the summer of 1944, the Philippines campaign had commenced. General Douglas MacArthur had made good on his famous promise. He had returned. His troops were fighting their way through Leyte and beyond. Meanwhile, Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded the great fleets of the United States Pacific Navy. They maintained their steady advance toward Okinawa and the ultimate prize of Japan itself. The oceans themselves had become a killing field for Japanese shipping. Once the Imperial Navy had ruled those waters with absolute authority. Now it was American submarines that controlled the depths. The silent service was proving devastatingly effective against Japanese commerce. Submarines like Archerfish had systematically destroyed Japan's merchant fleet. Oil tankers carrying precious fuel from the East Indies were being sunk faster than shipyards could replace them. Cargo vessels bringing food, weapons, and raw materials had become easy prey. The submarines hunted with patience and lethal torpedoes. By 1944, Japan had lost more than half of its merchant marine. The shortage was becoming catastrophic. Factories slowed their production lines. Fuel supplies dwindled to critical levels. Even basic necessities grew increasingly scarce throughout the empire. The mathematics of war had turned brutally against Japan. Where once the empire could replace losses in ships and aircraft, now each vessel destroyed was irreplaceable. The great shipyards that had produced the fleet which struck Pearl Harbor were now struggling simply to repair damaged vessels. Building new ships had become nearly impossible. Steel was desperately scarce. Skilled workers had been drafted into military service. American bombing raids were beginning to target industrial centers with increasing frequency. Above the waves, the situation was equally grim. The United States Navy had assembled the most powerful carrier strike groups ever seen in naval warfare. The fast carriers of the 3rd and 5th Fleets ranged freely across the Pacific. Their aircraft pounded Japanese bases without fear of retaliation. They struck the home islands themselves with impunity. The skies were no longer safe anywhere within the empire. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers, with their immense range, had begun systematic daylight bombing runs against Japan's cities. Tokyo burned under their firestorms. Nagoya was reduced to rubble. More raids were planned and executed weekly. The Imperial Navy, once the most modern and feared force in the Pacific, was now a shadow of its former strength. Its naval air arm had been decimated at Midway in June 1942. Its battleships had been bloodied in the Solomons campaign and again in the Marianas. At the Great Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in human history, Japan had committed everything it had left in one final desperate gamble. The result had been complete disaster. Fleet carriers like Zuikaku, a veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack, had been sent to the bottom. The mighty battleship Musashi had been destroyed under relentless waves of American bombs and torpedoes. Even though Yamato, the largest battleship afloat, had survived the encounter, she had been severely damaged and forced to retreat. The human cost was equally devastating for Japan. The empire's experienced pilots, the elite aviators who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack with such deadly precision, were nearly all dead. Their replacements arrived at the front with hasty training. Many had logged less than 50 hours of flight time before being sent into combat. American pilots, by contrast, arrived at the front with hundreds of hours of comprehensive training behind them. The result was systematic slaughter in the skies above the Pacific. Japanese aircraft were being shot down at ratios of 10 to 1. Sometimes the ratios were even worse. Japan was running out of time, running out of ships, running out of trained personnel, running out of realistic options for continuing the war. Yet even in this increasingly desperate situation, the nation clung to one final hope, a hope that some powerful new weapon could shift the balance of power, even if only temporarily. That weapon was not another battleship design. It was not a revolutionary new aircraft. It was a ship unlike anything the world had ever seen. A carrier so massive, so heavily armored, and so absolutely secret that the Allies had no confirmation of its existence. Her name was Shinano, named after an ancient Japanese province. Born from the hull of what would have been a Yamato-class battleship, she was intended to be untouchable, a floating fortress at sea. Japanese planners believed desperately that if this carrier could be completed and deployed, she might anchor their defensive line around the home islands. Perhaps she could carry enough aircraft and special attack weapons to blunt the American advance. Maybe she could even threaten the invasion fleets that were surely being assembled. The strategic thinking behind Shinano reflected Japan's evolving military doctrine. No longer could the Imperial Navy dream of decisive battles where superior training and equipment would guarantee victory. Instead, they needed a ship that could survive concentrated American air attacks. She would serve as a floating base for aircraft repair operations. She would deliver the new suicide weapons that were becoming central to Japanese strategy. The Oka rocket-powered kamikaze planes and Shinyo explosive motorboats represented a grim calculation. Japanese planners believed that Japanese lives could be traded for American ships at favorable ratios. This was the mathematics of desperation dressed in the language of honor. But even as Japan built Shinano, the harsh realities of war pressed in from all sides. Shipyard workers toiled in shifts that stretched 16 hours or more. Critical materials were increasingly scarce. Quality control slipped under impossible deadlines. The pressure to complete Shinano was enormous. So enormous that vital safety tests were skipped entirely. The Empire needed this ship. They needed her operational immediately. In Tokyo, military leaders clung to increasingly desperate illusions. If Shinano could deploy with a full air group, she might bring down swarms of B-29 bombers. If she could sail to the Philippines, she might disrupt MacArthur's landing operations. If she could simply appear off Okinawa or Formosa, her mere presence might shake American confidence and buy precious time. The war was slipping away like water through cupped hands. But perhaps, just perhaps, one great ship could slow the inevitable collapse. Yet desperation makes a poor substitute for genuine strength. Japan was already resorting to measures that revealed how dire the situation had truly become. The kamikaze corps was not a sign of strength, but rather an admission of weakness. It represented acknowledgement that conventional warfare was no longer possible for Japan. Young pilots, some barely out of their teenage years, were being told that their highest service to the emperor was to die by ramming their aircraft into American ships. It was a strategy born of complete despair. Dressed up in traditional language about honor and duty, the seas around Japan were no longer friendly waters. American submarines hunted the coastal approaches with relentless efficiency. Wolf packs of 3 or 4 boats would coordinate their attacks on Japanese convoys. They sank escorts and merchant vessels with equal enthusiasm. In late November 1944, as Shinano prepared to leave her protected shipyard, dozens of submarines lurked in the approaches to Tokyo Bay. They had divided the patrol areas into specific zones. Each boat was responsible for its assigned sector. All submarines reported contacts to coordinate interceptions across the entire area. Most of those submarine crews would never know that Shinano existed, but one submarine would encounter her. That single meeting would decide her ultimate fate. The broader strategic picture was crystal clear to any objective military observer. Japan had already lost the war. The only questions that remained were how long the fighting would continue and how many people would die before the inevitable end. But for those caught directly in the machinery of war, the sailors and shipbuilders and pilots, such clarity was impossible to achieve. They continued to fight and build and hope because the alternative was literally unthinkable. By November 1944, Japan had become an empire under siege, its seas patrolled by unseen predators lurking beneath the waves, its skies burned regularly by incendiary bombs dropped from high altitude, its cities trembling under the absolute certainty of eventual invasion. Into that gathering storm sailed Shinano, a colossal ship, unready for combat, untested in battle, carrying the burden of a dying nation's last desperate hopes. And waiting for her in the darkness, completely unseen, was a submarine commanded by a man seeking personal redemption. Every great warship begins its existence as nothing more than drawings on paper, lines on blueprints that promise steel and power and national prestige. The story of Shinano began exactly that way. But her ultimate destiny would change more than once before she ever touched salt water for the first time. She was originally conceived in 1940, at the absolute height of Japanese naval ambition. She was planned as the third ship of the Yamato-class battleships. These vessels were designed to be the largest, heaviest, and most heavily armed battleships ever constructed by human hands. They would outmatch anything afloat in the American or British fleets. Their armor would be thicker than any competitor. Their guns would be larger and more powerful. Their displacement would be greater than any battleship in history. They were intended as symbols of an empire that demanded dominance of the world's oceans. The Yamato class represented a philosophy of naval warfare that had guided Japanese thinking for decades. Japanese strategic planners were acutely aware that their nation could never match American industrial capacity ship for ship. Therefore, they believed absolutely in qualitative superiority over numerical advantage. If Japan could not build more ships than America, it would build decisively better ships. Each Yamato-class battleship would be worth 2 or 3 of its American counterparts in combat. Their massive 18.1-inch guns could strike targets at ranges where enemy vessels could not respond effectively. Their armor could absorb shell hits that would cripple lesser warships. 2 of Shinano's sister ships were completed according to that original battleship design. Yamato and Musashi each mounted 9 immense guns capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds. They could fire farther and with more destructive power than any naval artillery that had come before them. These shells could penetrate 16 inches of armor plating at ranges exceeding 25 miles. Shinano's keel was laid down at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, one of the Empire's most prestigious shipyards. Every expectation was that she would follow her sisters into the Pacific as a floating fortress of unprecedented power. The construction began with traditional ceremony and national pride. Shinto priests blessed the ground where she would rise from steel and rivets. The emperor himself was personally informed of the project's commencement. The finest steel available was allocated exclusively to her construction. The most experienced shipbuilders in Japan were assigned to her completion. According to the original plans, she would displace 72,000 tons when fully loaded for combat. She would mount the same massive main battery as her sister ships. She would cruise at 27 knots despite her enormous bulk. She represented not just a weapon of war but a statement of Japanese technical excellence and industrial capability. But wars have a way of completely reshaping even the grandest dreams. In June 1942, Japan suffered a devastating and unexpected defeat at the Battle of Midway. 4 fleet carriers were lost in a single day of combat. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu all went to the bottom of the Pacific. Along with those carriers went hundreds of irreplaceable experienced pilots. The backbone of Japan's naval aviation had been shattered in one catastrophic battle. That defeat shifted the balance of power in the Pacific permanently and irreversibly. No longer could Japan rely on its carrier forces to project power as it had during the early triumphs of 1941 and 1942. The losses at Midway forced a fundamental and complete reassessment of Japanese naval strategy. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, had proven themselves to be the truly decisive weapons of modern naval warfare. The age of the big gun was rapidly ending. The age of naval aviation had definitively arrived. Japanese naval planners looked at Shinano's massive hull, still incomplete in her construction dock, and faced a crucial strategic choice. To finish her as originally designed meant producing another gun platform in an era when aircraft carriers determined the outcome of naval battles. To abandon her construction entirely was unthinkable given the enormous resources already invested. The answer became obvious to everyone involved. Shinano would be converted into an aircraft carrier. Not just any carrier, but the largest and most heavily protected carrier the world had ever seen. The conversion process would be radical and incredibly complex. The lower hull, already shaped specifically for a battleship's requirements, had to be completely adapted for entirely different purposes. Her armored citadel, originally designed to withstand the impact of enormous naval shells, was reconfigured to support an expansive hangar deck above. Where massive gun turrets would have been mounted, aircraft elevators were installed instead. The superstructure was completely redesigned and shifted to starboard in the classic style of aircraft carriers. A flight deck measuring 840 feet long and 130 feet wide was constructed above everything else. Unlike other aircraft carriers in the Japanese fleet, Shinano would not be designed primarily to launch vast offensive airstrikes against enemy fleets. Instead, she was envisioned as a support carrier and mobile fortress. She could protect other ships with her unprecedented armor protection. She could repair damaged aircraft during battle operations. She could carry suicide planes and explosive motorboats designed specifically for special attack missions. Her massive hangar could accommodate 47 operational aircraft at any given time. Storage space was provided for another 70 aircraft in shipping crates that could be rapidly assembled as battle replacements became necessary. She would serve as a floating strategic reserve, capable of replenishing the depleted air groups of other carriers that had suffered combat losses. This operational concept reflected the dramatically changing nature of Japanese naval strategy. By 1944, Japan could no longer realistically count on massing hundreds of well-trained pilots for conventional naval battles. The experienced aviators who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack with such devastating precision were mostly dead. Their hastily trained replacements were woefully inadequate, often arriving at combat units with less than 50 hours of total flight time. Instead of relying on conventional air power projection, Japan increasingly sought weapons of shock and desperation. Shinano would become their primary arsenal for these new tactics. The secrecy surrounding her construction was absolutely unprecedented in naval history. Japanese military leaders feared that American long-range bombers would destroy the ship before she could ever sail from her construction yard. The Navy implemented extraordinary security measures to prevent discovery. The dry dock where Shinano was being assembled was completely enclosed under a massive concrete roof structure. This protective covering was supported by enormous steel girders and effectively turned the entire construction site into a vast covered workshop. The concrete roof shielded her from any prying eyes that might be watching from high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. The civilian workers who labored on her hull were essentially imprisoned within the shipyard boundaries. They lived in specially constructed barracks located directly on the construction site. They were absolutely forbidden to leave the yard or communicate with anyone in the outside world. They were explicitly threatened with imprisonment or execution if they revealed even a single word about what they were building. Military police units patrolled the entire perimeter of the construction area around the clock. Not a single photograph of Shinano under construction was permitted to leave the shipyard. Even within the Imperial Navy itself, knowledge of Shinano's existence was tightly controlled and compartmentalized. Only a very select few senior officers were permitted to know her actual specifications and capabilities. All official documents referring to her used elaborate code names instead of her real designation. When she finally emerged from her concealed construction dock, she would be a complete surprise, not just to the Americans, but even to many of her own countrymen. This unprecedented level of operational secrecy created significant problems of its own. Suppliers delivering materials and components often had no idea what they were contributing to. Coordination between different departments and specialties suffered badly. Critical mistakes that might have been caught through normal oversight procedures went completely unnoticed. Her final design pushed the absolute limits of naval engineering knowledge and capability. With a full combat load displacement of 71,890 tons, Shinano dwarfed every other aircraft carrier afloat anywhere in the world. Her armored flight deck, an extremely rare feature among carrier designs, could resist direct hits from 1,000-pound bombs. Her armored belt, measuring up to 8 inches thick at the waterline, provided a level of protection completely unknown in previous carrier construction. Her hangar was divided by heavy armor bulkheads into separate sections, specifically intended to prevent a single bomb or torpedo hit from crippling the entire vessel. Her propulsion system consisted of 4 massive steam turbines, producing a combined 150,000 shaft horsepower. This enormous power plant was designed to drive her at speeds of 27 knots, despite her incredible bulk. Her defensive armament was absolutely formidable by any standard. 16 5-inch dual-purpose guns were mounted in 8 twin turrets, capable of engaging both surface vessels and aircraft targets effectively. Over 125mm anti-aircraft guns were distributed strategically across her hull, creating multiple overlapping fields of defensive fire. 12 massive rocket launchers stood ready to unleash devastation. Each launcher held 28 barrels. They could fire explosive shells in rapid succession. The shells would create a steel barrier against enemy planes. Aircraft would find it nearly impossible to penetrate such defenses. Yet this impressive firepower masked a darker reality. Shinano emerged from a shipyard in crisis. The skilled workers who once built magnificent vessels were gone. Military service had claimed the experienced craftsmen. Those who had created Yamato and Musashi no longer stood at the shipyard benches. Their replacements told a story of desperation. Conscripts worked alongside frightened students. Prisoners of war labored under guard. None possessed the years of training that shipbuilding demanded. Hands that should have moved with precision fumbled with unfamiliar tools. Quality standards collapsed like a house built on sand. Welds that required X-ray examination received only quick visual checks. Workers peered at joints with tired eyes. Critical flaws went undetected. Tolerances measured in precise millimeters expanded to rough centimeters. Standards that had defined Japanese excellence crumbled under wartime pressure. The construction timeline became a relentless master. Tokyo's demands echoed through the shipyard. November 1944 stood as an unmovable deadline. Work never stopped. Day blended into night. Men labored until their bodies betrayed them. Workers collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Their unconscious forms were carried away like broken machinery. New hands immediately took their places. Summer heat turned the covered dock into a furnace. Metal surfaces burned skin on contact. Sweat poured from workers in constant streams. The air itself seemed to pulse with heat. Winter brought different torments. Fingers went numb in the cold. Tools slipped from frozen hands. Workers breathed clouds of vapor with each exhale. Accidents multiplied like infections. Men tumbled from towering scaffolding. Massive steel plates crushed bodies beneath their weight. Welding fumes overcame workers in confined spaces. Each death was recorded in silence. The war effort mattered more than individual lives. Official reports buried the casualties beneath bureaucratic language. Even materials suffered from wartime shortages. Special steel intended for armor plates disappeared to other urgent projects. Substitutes replaced carefully selected alloys. Electrical components became precious resources. Much of the wiring had arrived before the war began. When supplies vanished, workers improvised dangerous solutions. Systems designed with backup components became single points of failure. The great ship held together through determination as much as engineering. Yet despite these mounting problems, she continued taking shape. Month after month, her hull climbed higher into the covered sky. The flight deck stretched toward its final dimensions. Her island superstructure rose from the starboard side like a steel mountain. Those who witnessed her construction felt overwhelmed by her scale. Workers would stop their tasks just to stare. She represented more than a ship. She was a floating metropolis. She embodied human ambition in steel and rivets. October 8, 1944 dawned with electric anticipation at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. After 4 years of secret construction, Japan's greatest maritime gamble would taste water for the first time. The atmosphere crackled with nervous energy. This moment transcended a simple ship launch. It symbolized Japanese resilience against overwhelming odds. Even under constant bombardment and crushing blockade, the empire could still create marvels. Dawn brought elaborate ceremony to the shipyard. Shinto priests arrived in pristine white robes. They carried themselves with ancient dignity. Their movements followed rituals older than memory. Streaming paper banners waved in their hands. Ancient prayers echoed through the dry dock. Salt scattered from their fingers purified the sacred ground. An altar appeared near the massive bow. Offerings covered its surface in careful arrangement. Rice represented sustenance and life. Fish symbolized the bounty of the sea. Sake honored the spirits with liquid reverence. The priests called upon powerful forces. Water spirits heard their pleas. Wind spirits felt their devotion. Steel spirits accepted their offerings. High-ranking naval officers arrived in dress uniforms heavy with ceremonial weight. Medals covered their chests like armor made of honor. Representatives from the imperial household graced the ceremony with their presence. Workers exhausted from years of brutal labor received new clothing for this special day. They stood in neat formations. Pride temporarily overcame bone-deep fatigue. Military bands filled the air with martial music. Flags flew from every possible mounting point. The concrete roof that had hidden Shinano for so long had been partially removed. Shafts of golden sunlight illuminated her massive hull. The launch procedure had been planned with scientific precision. Dry dock number 6 would flood through carefully controlled valves. Rising water would lift Shinano from her building blocks. She would float free for the first time. Tugboats would guide her to a fitting-out pier. There, her final equipment would be installed. The shipyard had performed this procedure hundreds of times before. Nothing suggested anything could go wrong. At 10:30 a.m. sharp, the flooding order was given. Workers gripped valve wheels with both hands. Seawater began flowing into the dock through open channels. Everything proceeded according to plan initially. Water rose steadily, inch by careful inch. It crept up Shinano's hull like a rising tide. Spectators watched with breathless expectation. Then disaster struck without warning. The caisson gate sealing dry dock number 6 from Tokyo Bay collapsed completely. The massive steel barrier designed to hold back millions of tons of ocean failed catastrophically. Crushing pressure exceeded all design limits. Instead of controlled flooding, an unstoppable torrent burst inward. The sound defied description. Thunder seemed quiet by comparison. A roaring cascade drowned out every other noise. Millions of gallons of seawater surged into the dock in seconds. Shinano faced not a gentle rising, but a wall of liquid destruction. The massive ship lurched forward like a cork shot from a champagne bottle. Her 70,000 tons of steel became a battering ram driven by hydraulic force. She slammed into the dock's far wall with a grinding crash. The impact shook the earth itself. Tremors radiated through the shipyard like earthquake waves. Windows shattered a quarter-mile away. Glass rained down in deadly cascades. Mooring cables thick as a man's waist snapped like broken violin strings. The recoil sent them whipping through the air with lethal velocity. One cable decapitated a worker instantly. Another crushed 3 men against a crane's steel framework. The great hull rebounded from the impact like a rubber ball. Her stern smashed into the dock's side wall with tremendous force. She became a massive pendulum of destruction. Back and forth she swung, crushing everything in her path. For long, terrifying minutes, absolute chaos reigned supreme. Workers fled in blind panic. Some dove into the churning water to escape the swinging hull. Others were swept away by the raging torrent. Officers shouted orders that vanished in the roar. The carefully choreographed ceremony became a scene from hell. Band instruments scattered across the concrete. Flags tore away in the turbulence. The Shinto altar exploded into splinters. Sacred offerings disappeared beneath the churning waters. When the water finally stabilized, Shinano came to rest. The damage assessment began immediately. Miraculously, her hull had survived the violence. No fundamental structural damage had occurred to the ship herself. Her massive bulk bore dents and scrapes like battle scars. Twisted fittings and broken railings marked the encounter, but her basic integrity remained intact. The human cost told a different story entirely. 17 workers lay dead. 43 others suffered injuries ranging from broken bones to internal trauma. Some bodies were never recovered. The torrent had swept them out to sea. Others were crushed beyond recognition beneath shifting steel. The psychological damage cut deepest of all. To Japanese workers and sailors, ships possessed living spirits. These souls required proper honor and respect. A ship whose launch was marked by disaster carried a curse from the kami. The violent, uncontrolled launch represented the worst possible omen. Word spread through Yokosuka like wildfire. Then it traveled beyond the naval base. Whispers followed wherever Shinano's name was mentioned. She had killed men before even touching the sea properly. The ocean itself seemed to reject her presence. The kami had turned their faces away from this cursed vessel. Captain Toshio Abe arrived to command Shinano shortly after the disaster. A stern, practical officer who had survived the Battle of Midway, he possessed no patience for superstition. In a speech to the assembled crew, he dismissed the accident as meaningless coincidence. Steel and engines possessed no spirits, he declared firmly. Discipline and training won battles, not omens or ancient curses. But even as he spoke these rational words, he could see doubt flickering in his men's eyes. Sailors lived superstitious lives by nature. Japanese sailors especially honored the old beliefs. Many made private offerings at local shrines. They sought protection against the curse they believed clung to their ship like fog. Repairs from the launch disaster proceeded with desperate haste. Everything about Shinano had become a race against time. New steel plates were welded over damaged areas. Bent fittings were hammered straight or completely replaced. Fresh paint covered the visible scars. Within 3 weeks, external evidence of the catastrophe had been erased, but those who had witnessed the disaster could never forget. The image of that massive hull slamming back and forth remained burned in their memories. The screams of crushed workers echoed in their nightmares. The sense that something fundamental had gone wrong persisted like a fever. Work resumed at an even more frantic pace than before. The November deadline loomed larger with each passing day. The accident had cost precious time that could never be recovered. Safety procedures, already compromised by wartime pressures, were further reduced. The watertight doors that should have undergone pressure testing were merely checked to see if they closed. Electrical systems that demanded thorough inspection received only cursory reviews. The assumption seemed to be that if Shinano appeared complete from the outside, she was ready for service. Visual completeness replaced functional reliability. Appearance mattered more than performance. The crew assigned to Shinano reflected this dangerous haste. Normally, a carrier's complement would train together for months before deployment. They would drill until every man knew not just his own duties, but could fill in for others. Damage control required particular expertise above all other skills. Teams needed to work in perfect coordination when disaster struck. Ceiling-flooded compartments demanded split-second timing. Manning emergency pumps required trained hands. Fighting fires while the ship listed called for extraordinary skill. All of this needed to happen potentially in complete darkness, with alarms screaming. But Shinano's crew was assembled from wherever men could be found. Veterans from sunken ships brought hard-won experience. New recruits arrived fresh from training schools. Workers were conscripted directly from civilian life. They were thrown together with minimal time for organization. Many didn't even speak the same dialect of Japanese. Regional accents made communication difficult under stress. The officers attempted to conduct proper drills when time allowed. But time was always too short. The crew remained too inexperienced. When they practiced damage control procedures, confusion reigned absolute. Men got lost in the maze of passages that honeycombed the ship. Equipment was stored in wrong locations. Orders were misunderstood or never heard. Among the crew, talk of the curse persisted like an infection. Petty officers reported that men were requesting transfers to other ships. Some claimed sudden illness. Others injured themselves deliberately to avoid sailing on Shinano. The ship's chaplain, a Buddhist priest, conducted blessing after blessing. He tried desperately to calm mounting fears, but each ceremony seemed to emphasize the problem rather than solve it. Sailors wondered why their ship needed so many blessings if nothing was truly wrong. November arrived with suffocating urgency. The deadline was no longer approaching in the distance. It had arrived at their doorstep. Ready or not, Shinano had to sail into combat. The American submarine threat grew worse with each passing day. Intelligence reports painted an alarming picture. Dozens of enemy boats operated in Japanese coastal waters. B-29 bombers were ranging farther from their bases in the captured Marianas. Their massive formations grew bolder with each mission. It was only a matter of time before they discovered Shinano at her dock. The final weeks of preparation took on a desperate quality that infected everyone. Equipment that should have been carefully installed was literally thrown aboard in crates. Supplies were stacked wherever space could be found. The special weapons she was designed to carry arrived in the final days. 50 Oka suicide rocket planes were loaded into her hangars. Several Shinryu explosive motorboats joined them. These weapons themselves symbolized Japan's growing desperation. They seemed appropriate cargo for an equally desperate ship. On November 11, 1944, Shinano was officially commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ceremony was subdued compared to the attempted grandeur of her disastrous launch. No military bands played stirring marches. Few dignitaries bothered to attend. Captain Abe read the official orders in a flat, emotionless voice. The rising sun flag was raised on her mast for the first time. She was now officially a warship of the Imperial Navy. Though she was hardly ready for actual combat, the commissioning ceremony revealed just how incomplete she truly remained. Of her 12 massive boilers, only 8 were operational. This reduced her maximum speed from the designed 27 knots to approximately 20 knots. Her radar systems functioned only partially at best. Half of her anti-aircraft guns lacked adequate ammunition supplies. The aircraft elevators that would lift planes from hangar to flight deck had never been tested under actual load. Most critically of all, many of her watertight doors had never undergone pressure testing. These barriers could seal off flooded compartments in an emergency. They represented the difference between survival and sinking. Captain Abe compiled a detailed list of deficiencies that ran to 17 typed pages. He submitted it to Naval Headquarters along with a formal request to delay sailing. At least the most critical repairs should be completed before departure. The response arrived swift and uncompromising. Shinano would sail exactly as scheduled. The naval staff's reasoning was political as much as military in nature. Word of the supercarrier's existence was beginning to spread beyond classified circles. She needed to be revealed as a symbol of Japanese strength. She could not be discovered as a bombed wreck in dry dock. The sailing orders were specific and non-negotiable. Shinano would depart Yokosuka on the night of November 28th. She would steam south along the familiar coastline. Her destination was Kure Naval Base in the protected inland sea. There, shielded from submarines by narrow straits and from bombers by distance, she would complete her fitting-out process. The voyage would require only about 20 hours of steaming. What possibly could go wrong in such a short time? The crew prepared for departure with a mixture of pride and mounting dread. They were about to sail on the world's largest warship. She represented a technological marvel that no other nation could match. Yet they were also sailing on an unfinished ship with an untrained crew, many of whom believed her cursed by angry spirits. Last letters were written to families back home. Personal effects were carefully stowed away. Some men visited local Shinto shrines, leaving offerings and desperate prayers. Others got drunk on sake, trying to drown their fears in alcohol. The escort force assigned for the voyage seemed inadequate for such a valuable target. Just 3 destroyers would accompany the mighty carrier. Isokaze would take the lead position. Yukikaze and Hamikaze would guard the flanks. All 3 destroyers were veterans of numerous fierce battles. Their crews possessed hard-won experience, but their ships showed the wear of constant combat. Radar and sonar systems had been damaged in previous engagements. Repairs had been only partially completed. They would have to rely more on human lookouts than electronic instruments. For protecting the world's largest aircraft carrier, the escort seemed dangerously inadequate, but every available destroyer was desperately needed elsewhere. The night of November 28, 1944, began with deceptive calm that masked approaching disaster. At Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, the massive form of Shinano prepared for her maiden voyage. Steam built steadily in her operational boilers. Navigation lights flickered to life across her hull. On her bridge, Captain Abe reviewed the navigation charts one final time. The planned route appeared straightforward enough. South along the familiar coastline, around the Izu Peninsula, then west to the safety of Kure. They would travel under cover of darkness to avoid American bomber formations. They would stay close to shore to minimize exposure to enemy submarines. At 6 p.m. precisely, Shinano's mooring lines were cast off for the last time. Tugboats nudged her massive bulk away from the pier where she was born. Her screws began to turn slowly at first. Then they gathered power and authority. The great ship moved under her own power for the very first time. Despite everything that had gone wrong, the rushed construction, the cursed launch, the incomplete systems, she remained magnificent. Her hull stretched nearly 900 feet from bow to stern. Her flight deck rose 60 feet above the dark water. She displaced more tonnage than most harbors could handle. She was, by any reasonable measure, an engineering triumph of the highest order. The 3 destroyers took up their assigned screening positions with practiced efficiency. Isokaze moved into the lead position. Yukikaze and Hamikaze took their places on the flanks. Together, the 4 ships headed toward the harbor entrance. Beyond lay the open sea and unknown dangers. As they passed through the submarine nets protecting the harbor, several crew members noticed what they interpreted as another bad omen. A dead albatross floated in the dark water. Its white wings were spread wide like a surrender flag. The sight sent shivers through superstitious sailors. What none aboard the Japanese ships knew was crucial information. 30 miles to the south, USS Archerfish was beginning her patrol mission. The American submarine had been stationed on lifeguard duty. She was positioned to rescue American airmen from a bombing raid, but weather had canceled the mission. Now free to hunt for targets, Commander Enright had brought his boat to the surface. The crew was recharging batteries and refreshing the stale air below. The night offered perfect conditions for submarine operations. Darkness would hide their low silhouette from enemy eyes. The sea was calm enough for excellent sound conditions. Just enough moonlight remained to spot potential targets. At 8:48 p.m., Archerfish's radar operator made a crucial contact. The call echoed through the submarine. Contact, bearing 020, range 12 miles. The blip on the radar screen was large and steady. It moved southwest at approximately 20 knots. This was no ordinary merchant vessel. Enright rushed to the bridge, binoculars in hand. On the distant horizon, barely visible through the darkness, he could make out a massive dark shape. Smaller forms moved nearby as escorts. His pulse quickened with excitement. The size, the speed, the escort pattern, everything suggested a major Japanese warship. "Battle stations," Enright ordered quietly but urgently. Throughout the submarine, men moved to their positions with practiced efficiency born of months of training. In the forward torpedo room, crews checked their deadly weapons one final time. In the control room, plotting teams prepared their charts and calculating boards with precise care. The hunt was officially on. But Enright faced an immediate tactical problem. The target was maintaining 20 knots through the water. Archerfish's maximum surface speed was only 19 knots. In simple mathematical terms, the submarine couldn't catch her intended prey. But Enright possessed years of experience hunting Japanese ships. He knew they often zigzagged to avoid submarine attacks. Those course changes would inevitably slow their overall advance. If he could anticipate the zigzag pattern and cut corners on the turns, he might be able to close the critical distance. For the next hour, Archerfish pursued at maximum speed. Her 4 diesel engines strained against their mechanical limits. The submarine vibrated with tremendous effort. Her hull cut through the ocean swells. Spray broke continuously over her bow. Below deck, engineers coaxed every possible revolution from the overworked engines. The temperature in the engine room soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men worked in carefully timed shifts. They rushed topside to gulp fresh air before returning to their hellish stations. On Shinanos Bridge, radar operators detected the American submarine almost immediately. The equipment might have been only partially functional, but it worked well enough to spot a surface contact at several miles' distance. Captain Abe received the contact report with grim satisfaction, rather than surprise. He had expected enemy submarines. The waters off Japan were infested with them like a plague. But he had developed plans to deal with this anticipated threat. "Signal the escorts," he ordered calmly. Enemy submarine bearing 170, distance 8,000 meters. Abe's tactical situation was more complex than it initially appeared. His ship, despite her impressive size and firepower, remained vulnerable to underwater attack. She carried no aircraft to spot lurking submarines from the air. Her own sonar systems were not yet operational. She depended entirely on her 3 escorts for protection, and he knew their capabilities were severely limited by battle damage and poor maintenance. The destroyer's sonar had been damaged in previous fierce engagements. Repairs had been made with inferior replacement components. Their depth charge racks were only partially filled. Critical supplies were desperately short throughout the fleet. Moreover, Abe faced a classic tactical dilemma. If he ordered the destroyers to pursue the trailing submarine, they would have to leave Shinano's side. This would potentially expose her to other submarines that might be lurking nearby. American wolf packs often operated with coordinated tactics. One boat would reveal itself to draw off the escorts. Others would move in for the actual kill. But if he kept the destroyers close for protection, the trailing submarine could shadow them indefinitely. It could radio their position to other enemy boats. It could call in aircraft when dawn arrived. Abe chose what seemed the most prudent course of action. He would keep his escorts in close formation. He would use speed and evasive maneuvers to shake off the persistent pursuit. "Execute zigzag pattern number 7, he ordered with authority. The helm swung over and Shinano's massive bulk began a series of predetermined course changes, 45 degrees to port first. Hold steady for exactly 10 minutes, then 60 degrees to starboard. Steady for 8 minutes, back to base course for 15 minutes, then repeat the entire sequence. The zigzag pattern was standard anti-submarine doctrine, but it carried significant drawbacks that worried experienced officers. Each turn inevitably cost both speed and distance toward the destination. What should have been a 20-hour voyage would now take considerably longer. Fuel consumption increased dramatically with each course change. Most critically of all, the pattern could be analyzed and predicted by an experienced submarine commander, which was exactly what Enright was doing with deadly precision. In Archerfish's cramped control room, the plotting team tracked each of Shinano's course changes with scientific accuracy. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bob Jinsky, the executive officer, bent over the chart table. He measured angles and calculated timing with mathematical precision. "She's following a standard zigzag pattern," he reported to Enright. "If we cut across her turns, we can gain significant distance." The chase became a deadly game of three-dimensional geometry. Shinano would turn away, temporarily opening the distance between hunter and prey. Archerfish would cut the corner, closing the gap once again. The submarine couldn't match the carrier's straight-line speed through the water, but by taking shorter routes during the turns, she could maintain contact. It required precise calculation and nerves of steel. One miscalculation would mean losing contact forever. One detection by the alert destroyers would result in a barrage of depth charges. As the deadly chase continued into the dark night, Shinano's incomplete construction began to exact its toll. At 11 p.m., a bearing on the starboard inboard propeller shaft began to overheat dangerously. The massive shaft, turning at high speed under full load, generated friction that the inadequate bearing couldn't properly dissipate. Temperature gauges climbed steadily into the red danger zone. The engineering officer faced a terrible choice with no good options. He could continue running at full speed and risk catastrophic mechanical failure, or he could reduce speed and perhaps fall prey to the pursuing submarine. After consulting with Captain Abe, he chose to reduce speed on the affected shaft. Shinano's forward progress dropped from 20 knots to 18 knots. The reduction seemed small and insignificant, but it proved absolutely critical to the unfolding drama. Now Archerfish could not just keep pace with her target. She could actually gain ground with each passing hour. On the American submarine, the sonar operator reported the subtle change in the target's engine signature. "She's slowing down," he announced with barely contained excitement. Enright permitted himself a tight smile of satisfaction. The geometry of the hunt had shifted decisively in his favor. But Shinano's mechanical troubles were only beginning to multiply. The rapid zigzagging, combined with her incomplete and rushed construction, stressed systems throughout the massive ship. Electrical connections that had been hastily installed began to fail under the constant vibration. Lights flickered intermittently in some compartments before going dark completely. Ventilation fans stopped without warning. The temperature in the lower decks, already uncomfortable, became truly stifling. Men working in the engine rooms had to be rotated every 20 minutes to prevent dangerous heat exhaustion. More seriously, the constant course changes caused the ship to roll and flex in ways her incomplete structure wasn't designed to handle. Seams that had been inadequately welded under wartime pressure began to work open gradually, not enough to cause immediate catastrophic flooding, but enough to allow steady seepage of seawater. Water began to accumulate in some of the lower compartments like a slowly rising threat. Emergency pumps were started to deal with the growing problem, but several critical pumps failed when put to the test. They had never been properly tested under actual operating conditions. Now, under real use for the first time, their manufacturing defects became fatally apparent. On the bridge, Captain Abe received report after report of mounting mechanical issues. Each problem was relatively minor by itself. But collectively they painted a disturbing picture of a ship literally coming apart under operational stress. He faced yet another agonizing decision with potentially fatal consequences. He could order further speed reduction, carefully nursing his ship toward port. But this would make her an even easier target for the pursuing submarine. Or he could maintain current speed and risk more serious mechanical breakdowns that could leave them dead in the water. He chose a compromise course that satisfied no one, reducing speed to 16 knots while moderating the zigzag pattern to reduce stress on the hull. By 2 a.m. on November 29th, the deadly underwater dance had continued for over 5 exhausting hours. Archerfish had methodically closed to within 7,000 yards of her massive target, still too far for an effective torpedo attack against a moving target, but close enough to maintain solid contact and continue the methodical pursuit. The submarine's crew was physically exhausted but mentally exhilarated. They could sense they were steadily gaining on their prey. Enright studied the accumulated tracking data with intense concentration, planning his final approach. The pattern emerged with deadly clarity. Despite her erratic movements, Shinano kept returning to the same southwestern heading, 210 degrees, always back to that bearing, always aimed toward Kure. Enright studied the zigzag course from his cramped conning tower. The massive carrier would dart left, then right, then left again. But underneath the evasive maneuvers lay predictability. She was following a base course like a thread through a maze. If he could position Archerfish along that invisible line, if he could anticipate when she would steady up, the opportunity would present itself. The chance he had been stalking for hours through the black Pacific night. The submarine needed to go deeper, not to the crushing depths where pressure could split her hull, just deep enough to hide while keeping her radar eye above the waves. "Take her down to radar depth," he commanded. The diving klaxon echoed through the steel corridors. Men moved with practiced efficiency. Ballast tanks flooded with rushing seawater. The submarine's bow tilted downward. Her hull slipped beneath the surface until only the thin radar antenna remained above the waves. Speed dropped immediately. The water's resistance slowed their pursuit. But invisibility had its price. Now they were truly hunting from the shadows, a predator concealed in the ocean's dark embrace. Above the waves, Shinano's mood grew heavier with each passing hour. The submarine's persistence gnawed at nerves already stretched thin. Officers gathered in hushed groups, voices tight with speculation. Why hadn't the American boat attacked yet? Why hadn't their escorts driven it away? The questions multiplied like shadows in the mind. Some suggested coordination, multiple submarines converging. A carefully laid trap. Captain Abe dismissed such talk with sharp words, but privately, doubt crept into his thoughts. American submarine tactics had evolved since Pearl Harbor. Gone were the cautious approaches of early war. Now they hunted in packs. Now they showed ruthless aggression. At 26 minutes past 2 in the morning, fate shifted the board. Isokazi, running point for the formation, detected something off the starboard bow. A shadow that shouldn't be there. A wake that caught moonlight wrong. Periscope bearing 340. The lookout's cry pierced the night air. No hesitation from Isokazi's captain. No waiting for permission from the flagship. His destroyer leaped forward like a hunting dog released from leash. 35 knots. The bow wave rose white and angry as the destroyer charged toward the suspected contact. Her wake spread behind her in a phosphorescent V. Steam poured from her funnels as her engines screamed at full power. In Archerfish's sonar compartment, the operator's voice cracked with urgency. High-speed screws approaching fast, destroyer bearing 340 closing at flank speed. The sound filled his headphones, the distinctive whine of Japanese turbines pushed beyond their limits. Enright faced the submarine commander's eternal dilemma: crash dive and lose his target forever, or hold depth and risk detection by active sonar. Seconds to decide, heartbeats to choose between opportunity and survival. He chose the middle path. Deep enough to hide, shallow enough to recover quickly. Dive to 150 feet, rig for silent running, rig for depth charge attack. The submarine plunged into darker water. Every system designed for stealth came alive. Ventilation fans stopped. Unnecessary equipment shut down. Men moved like ghosts through the corridors. Communication reduced to hand signals and whispers. Isokazi thundered overhead. Her screws chopped the water into foam just above their heads. The sound penetrated the hull like approaching thunder. Every man held his breath. Every heart beat against ribs like a trapped bird. The splash of depth charges never came. Isokazi had lost the scent as quickly as she'd found it. Worse for the Japanese formation, she had broken Captain Abe's explicit orders. The destroyer had abandoned her station, leaving gaps in the screen. Sharp light signals flashed from Shinano's bridge, angry commands in Morse code. Return to formation immediately. Isokazi's captain had no choice but to comply, his unauthorized attack ending in failure and embarrassment. The moment the destroyer turned away, Enright seized his chance. Archerfish rose toward the surface like a steel shark, sensing blood. Periscope depth, the sweet spot where observation met concealment. Shinano still dominated the horizon, 4,000 yards of target presenting herself like an offering to the torpedo gods. The carrier held her course with mechanical precision, unaware that death was calculating angles in the darkness below. At 15 minutes after 3 in the morning, the cosmic tumblers clicked into alignment. Shinano steadied on her base course of 210 degrees. No more zigzagging, no more evasive maneuvers, just steady progress toward her intended destination. She presented her full length to Archerfish, 1,400 yards away, 16 knots through calm seas. In submarine warfare terminology, it was the textbook approach: close enough for accuracy, angled for maximum damage, slow enough for a perfect firing solution. Enright pressed his eye to the periscope lens one final time. The carrier filled his entire field of view, massive beyond anything in the recognition manuals. Her flight deck stretched like an aircraft runway. Her island structure rose like a skyscraper. Lights glowed in scattered portholes. The shadows of escort ships moved like attendants around their queen. White water curled away from her bow as she cut through the Pacific swells. He sketched rapidly on the plotting table, recording her unusual profile. The rounded bow that didn't match any carrier design in American intelligence files. The oversized island. The sheer scale that dwarfed every other ship in the formation. Final bearing and shoot. Make ready all tubes forward. In the torpedo room, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes waited in their steel cradles. These weapons had plagued the submarine force early in the war. Faulty detonators that refused to explode. Depth mechanisms that ran too deep. Magnetic exploders that triggered prematurely. But the problems had been solved through desperate trial and error. Now they were reliable ship killers. Each torpedo carried 600 pounds of Torpex explosive, each one capable of breaking a warship's back if it found the right spot on the hull. Set depth 10 feet. An unusually shallow setting. Most submarine commanders aimed for the deep waterline where flooding would be immediate and devastating. But Enright remembered advice from a senior officer who had studied carrier construction. Hit them high on the hull. Damage their stability, not just their buoyancy. A carrier that couldn't stay upright was a carrier that couldn't launch aircraft. Sometimes the lesson learned in one battle could determine the outcome of the next. The fire control party made their final calculations. Target speed fed into the mechanical computer. Target angle measured and remeasured. Distance confirmed through multiple observations. The torpedo data computer clicked and whirred, its analog brain calculating the precise firing angles needed. The solution was checked, then double-checked, then verified by a third party. There would be no second chance at a target this valuable. No time to reload if the first salvo missed. Everything had to be perfect on the first try. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as compressed air ejected the first torpedo from its tube. The weapon came alive immediately. Twin propellers spinning, electric motor humming, guidance system steering it toward the intercept point calculated by human brains and mechanical computers. Fire 2. 8 seconds between shots. Time for each torpedo to clear the submarine's vicinity before the next one launched. Time for the weapon to arm itself and settle into its designated depth. Time for the fire control party to make final adjustments if needed. Fire 3, Fire 4, Fire 5, Fire 6. In less than 60 seconds, 6 instruments of destruction were racing through the black water toward Shinano. Their wakes barely visible as white lines drawn on dark canvas, their electric motors pushing them forward at 46 knots, their warheads armed and ready. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal, exactly as designed, exactly as tested, exactly as hoped for by every submarine commander who had ever squeezed a firing key and watched his weapons disappear into the darkness. On Shinano's bridge, a lookout spotted the phosphorescent trails too late for evasion. His cry pierced the night watch like a knife through silk. "Torpedo track starboard side." Captain Abe's response was immediate and correct. Full rudder to present the smallest possible target. Maximum speed to reduce the time available for torpedo impact. Emergency signals to alert damage control parties throughout the ship. But Shinano's massive bulk responded like a floating mountain. Her rudder bit into the water. Her engines increased their beat. But 70,000 tons of aircraft carrier could not dance away from weapons that had already covered most of the distance between hunter and prey. The first torpedo struck with a sound like the world cracking open. A column of white water erupted alongside the hull, climbing higher than the flight deck before collapsing back into the sea. The entire ship lurched to port from the impact, throwing men against bulkheads and equipment across compartments. Before anyone could fully comprehend what was happening, the second torpedo found its mark, then the third, then the fourth. 4 hits in less than 30 seconds, all along the starboard side, all between the bow and the island structure where they would cause maximum damage to the ship's vital systems. The first torpedo struck at frame 104, near an aviation fuel storage area that Fortune had left empty. The explosion tore a 20-foot hole in the hull plates, allowing the Pacific Ocean to pour into adjacent compartments with unstoppable force. The second hit frame 142, obliterating the starboard outboard engine room in a cascade of superheated steam and seawater. The men on duty there died instantly. Their bodies never recovered from the twisted wreckage of machinery and collapsed bulkheads. The third torpedo struck frame 166, opening the number 3 fire room to the sea like a giant can opener. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut automatically, trapping some men in flooding spaces while saving others in adjacent compartments. The fourth hit frame 190, rupturing a fuel bunker and sending thick black oil flooding through passageways and ventilation systems. The smell of petroleum mixed with the metallic taste of fear as damage control parties rushed toward their assigned stations. For several heartbeats, those on Shinano's bridge struggled to process the magnitude of what had occurred. The ship shuddered with each torpedo impact, but her immense size made the damage seem almost insignificant, like pinpricks on an elephant. Captain Abe's first instinct was confidence. This ship had been built with battleship armor plating, designed to absorb multiple torpedo hits and continue fighting. Surely 4 torpedoes, even perfectly placed, could not sink the largest carrier in the world. But below decks, catastrophe was spreading like poison through the ship's steel arteries. The incomplete construction that had rushed Shinano to sea now became a death sentence written in faulty welds and untested systems. Watertight doors that had never faced real pressure jammed in their frames or refused to seal completely. Some closed with men trapped on the wrong side, their hammering and shouting growing weaker as water rose around them. Others remained stubbornly open, allowing flooding to spread unchecked. Hastily welded seams split apart under the stress of battle damage. Electrical panels, soaked with salt water, exploded in showers of sparks that sent men diving for cover. Emergency lighting flickered and failed, leaving damage control parties to work in darkness broken only by handheld flashlights. The ship's damage control organization, never properly drilled as a cohesive unit, responded with confusion and contradictory orders. Some teams rushed to flood port-side compartments to counteract the starboard list. Others attempted to pump out the flooded areas. The two efforts worked against each other, worsening the situation. In the surviving engine rooms, the situation approached desperation. Water was rising steadily in the starboard spaces, threatening the electrical systems that powered the pumps. Engineers worked waist-deep in oily seawater, trying to maintain power to the bilge pumps that represented their only hope of controlling the flooding. When water reached the main electrical switchboards, explosions of blue-white flame forced the engineers to abandon their posts. One by one, the starboard engines fell silent. The ship's list increased steadily as thousands of tons of seawater poured through the torpedo holes. 5 degrees, then 10 degrees, then 13 degrees of starboard list. On the flight deck, aircraft that had been securely chained began to slide toward the low side. Maintenance equipment rolled across the deck, sending sailors scrambling for safety. A fuel truck broke loose from its restraints and crashed into the base of the island structure with a sound like thunder. Boxes of ammunition tumbled across the tilted deck and splashed into the sea. Toolkits, spare parts, and personal belongings followed the same path to oblivion. Captain Abe maintained rigid military bearing on the bridge, but his orders reflected growing desperation. Counter-flooding to correct the list, but the ship's pumping capacity was already overwhelmed. Course change toward the nearest land, but with reduced power and steering problems, beaching seemed impossible. Emergency signals flashed toward Naval headquarters in coded bursts. Shinano torpedoed. Position 32 degrees north, 137 degrees east, attempting to reach shore. But even as he transmitted these messages, reports from below painted an increasingly grim picture. Flooding was spreading faster than damage control could contain it. The pumps were losing the battle against the sea. Half the crew couldn't find their emergency stations in the darkness. The ship was slowly, inevitably, dying beneath their feet. On Archerfish, Enright had taken his submarine deep immediately after firing the torpedoes. Now came the most dangerous period for any attacking submarine: the counterattack, the moment when the hunter became the hunted. Above them, Japanese destroyers converged like angry wasps. Their sonar systems probed the depths with electronic fingers. Their crews prepared patterns of depth charges designed to crush submarines like tin cans under a sledgehammer. 400 feet. Rig for silent running. Archerfish descended into the ocean's protective darkness. Every unnecessary system shut down. Every man moved like a ghost through the corridors. They could hear the destroyers above them through the steel hull, the high-pitched whine of turbines at full power, the methodical ping of active sonar searching for their hiding place. The first depth charge pattern exploded in sequence, 5 charges detonating like underwater thunder. The submarine bucked and rolled as shock waves passed through the water. Light bulbs shattered throughout the boat. Cork insulation rained down from the overhead like artificial snow. But the explosions were distant, at least 500 yards away. The Japanese sonar operators, working with equipment damaged by months of hard use and poor maintenance, couldn't achieve the precise fix needed for a killing attack. 14 more depth charges followed over the next hour. Each explosion sent tremors through Archerfish's hull. Each detonation rattled equipment and tested the submarine's structural integrity, but none came close enough to cause serious damage. Gradually, the sounds above grew fainter. The destroyers had abandoned their search and returned to their primary duty, protecting what remained of their formation and rescuing survivors from their stricken flagship. When Enright finally brought Archerfish back to periscope depth at dawn, the horizon stretched empty in all directions. Whatever had happened to the giant carrier during the night, she was no longer visible above the waves. As November 29th dawned gray and cold, Shinano was fighting her final battle. The list had increased to 20 degrees, making normal movement impossible. Sailors used ropes and handholds to pull themselves up the tilted decks, their feet slipping on surfaces that had never been designed for such angles. In the hangar deck, the Oka suicide planes had broken loose from their restraining cables. They slid into each other with crashes that echoed through the enclosed space, their volatile rocket fuel creating an extreme fire hazard that could have turned the ship into an inferno. The flooding had spread far beyond the original torpedo damage through a phenomenon that naval architects called progressive flooding. Water found pathways through cable runs, ventilation ducts, and improperly sealed doors. Like cancer spreading through a body, the sea invaded compartments that should have remained dry and safe. Thousands of tons of seawater had accumulated in the ship's lower spaces. The weight was dragging Shinano deeper into the Pacific swells. Her waterline was disappearing as the ocean claimed more and more of her hull. Captain Abe made one desperate final attempt to save his command, all remaining engines ahead full power. Drive the ship toward the nearest shore at maximum speed. Perhaps if they could beach her, some portion of the crew could be saved. Perhaps the ship herself could be salvaged. But with only the port engines functioning, Shinano could barely achieve 10 knots. The uneven thrust caused her to travel in wide circles, her rudder unable to compensate for the imbalanced propulsion. She was chasing her own tail while slowly sinking beneath the waves. At 30 minutes past 8 in the morning, Captain Abe authorized the preliminary abandonment signal. Not yet an order to abandon ship, but a warning to prepare for that possibility. The crew began gathering on the flight deck, helping wounded comrades up from the flooded spaces below. Life preservers were distributed from emergency lockers. The 3 destroyer escorts moved closer to their flagship, preparing to pick up survivors when the inevitable moment arrived. Rescue boats were lowered and positioned around the carrier's hull. Below decks, individual dramas of heroism and tragedy played out in flooded compartments and tilted passageways. Engineering officers remained at their posts until rising water forced them to retreat, keeping emergency power functioning for the pumps and lighting systems. Medical personnel worked in sick bays that tilted at impossible angles, trying to evacuate patients who couldn't be moved safely. In one compartment, 30 men found themselves trapped behind a hatch that had jammed shut during the torpedo impacts. Their hammering could be heard for over an hour before the sounds stopped forever. The end came with terrible swiftness. At 18 minutes past 10 in the morning, the list suddenly increased to 35 degrees. Equipment, aircraft, and human beings began sliding uncontrollably down the flight deck toward the churning sea. All hands abandon ship! But for many aboard Shinano, the order came too late. The list increased so rapidly that hundreds of men were trapped in compartments below decks. Others, attempting to climb the tilted flight deck to reach safety, lost their grip on the slippery steel surface and tumbled into the ocean. Some chose to jump from the flight deck rather than wait for the ship to take them down. It was a 60-foot drop that killed many on impact with the water. Others struck pieces of floating debris or were pulled under by the suction of the sinking ship. Captain Abe remained on his bridge as naval tradition demanded. He would go down with his ship, maintaining his dignity and honor to the final moment. Around him, senior officers made the same choice, tying themselves to their posts rather than attempt escape. They sang the national anthem as seawater rose around their feet. Their voices carried across the water to the survivors floating in the oil-slicked sea, a final act of defiance against the inevitable defeat. At 5 minutes before 11 o'clock, Shinano capsized completely. Her massive flight deck tilted past the vertical, then she rolled upside down like a dying whale. For several minutes, her hull remained visible above the surface, red anti-fouling paint and marine growth gleaming in the morning sunlight. Then, with a tremendous roar of escaping air and collapsing compartments, she plunged toward the ocean floor 4,000 meters below. The largest warship ever built had survived exactly 17 hours at sea from the moment she left port to the moment she disappeared forever. The area where Shinano sank became a scene of desperate rescue operations and heartbreaking tragedy. Over 2,000 officers and enlisted men had been aboard when the torpedoes struck. Now hundreds struggled in the cold Pacific waters, coated with fuel oil, clinging to debris, calling for help. The 3 destroyer escorts moved among the survivors, but their rescue efforts were hampered by naval tradition and wartime brutality. Officers were to be saved first, regardless of their condition. Enlisted men would be picked up only after all officers were accounted for. Some destroyer captains, hardened by years of war and loss, refused to pick up men who showed signs of panic or despair. "Save only the brave," one captain told his crew. "Japan needs fighters, not cowards." The result was additional tragedy heaped upon an already catastrophic loss. Men who had survived the sinking and the initial plunge into the sea drowned within sight of rescue ships. Others, covered in thick fuel oil, were too slippery for rescue nets and ropes. They slipped back beneath the waves despite desperate efforts to save them. The November sea was bitterly cold. Hypothermia claimed those who weren't picked up within the first hour. Body heat drained away into the Pacific, leaving strong swimmers as helpless as children. Some survivors simply gave up, removing their life jackets and allowing themselves to sink rather than continue the struggle. When the rescue operations finally ended, only 1,080 men had been pulled from the water. The remaining 1,435, including Captain Abe and most of his senior officers, were dead. It ranked among the largest losses of life from a single ship sinking during the entire Pacific War. For Japan, the loss represented a catastrophe that had to be concealed from both the enemy and the domestic population. Shinano had been one of the nation's most closely guarded secrets. Her existence was known only to a handful of high-ranking officials and the men who had built and sailed her. Survivors were sworn to absolute secrecy under threat of court-martial and execution. Families of the dead were informed only that their loved ones had died heroically in action. No details about location, circumstances, or the name of their ship were provided. Official records of the sinking were classified at the highest levels and stored in safes that would remain locked for decades. To the Japanese public, Shinano had never existed. Her construction, her brief service, and her tragic loss were erased from history, but secrets proved difficult to maintain in the interconnected world of naval warfare. American codebreakers, intercepting and deciphering Japanese radio traffic, learned of a major sinking within days of the event. The name Shinano appeared in decoded messages, along with position reports and casualty figures. Intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor and Washington were puzzled by the references. Their databases contained no record of a Japanese ship by that name. What exactly had Archerfish sunk in those dark morning hours of November 29th? When Commander Enright filed his official patrol report in December 1944, claiming to have torpedoed and sunk an aircraft carrier of unprecedented size, he was met with institutional skepticism. Navy intelligence insisted that no such vessel existed in the Japanese fleet. The largest carrier they would credit him with sinking was a conventional fleet carrier of approximately 28,000 tons. Still a significant victory, but far short of the massive warship he described in his detailed report. Enright's protests were noted and filed away, but not believed. Only after Japan's surrender, when American investigation teams gained access to Japanese naval records, was the full truth revealed. Shinano had displaced 71,990 tons when fully loaded. She was indeed the largest aircraft carrier ever constructed and remains the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine attack. Commander Enright's instincts and observations had been completely accurate. His description of the target's enormous size had been precise. His redemption from earlier patrol failures was now complete and officially recognized. The story of Shinano's single, fatal voyage carries lessons that extend far beyond the specific events of November 1944. It serves as a cautionary tale about hubris and overconfidence, about the dangers of rushing complex systems into service before they are truly ready. It demonstrates how the smallest predator can bring down the mightiest prey when circumstances align perfectly. For Japan, Shinano represented the ultimate failure of the decisive weapon philosophy that had guided much of their wartime strategy. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese planners had sought single, war-winning weapons, super battleships like Yamato and Musashi, divine wind kamikaze attacks, miracle carriers like Shinano. But wars are won by systems and logistics, not by individual symbols of power. While Japan expended enormous resources building one massive carrier, America constructed dozens of smaller, more practical vessels. While Japan rushed incomplete ships to sea with inadequately trained crews, America took the time to properly prepare both ships and sailors for combat operations. The inevitable result was demonstrated in waters off Cape Omizaki on that November night. Superior numbers, better training, and more thorough preparation triumphed over size and theoretical capability. The technical lessons were equally clear and remain relevant to naval construction today. Size without reliability becomes vulnerability rather than strength. Armor plating without proper damage control procedures provides false security that can prove fatal in actual combat conditions. A warship's true strength lies not merely in steel thickness and gun caliber, but in the training and competence of her crew, the quality and thoroughness of her construction, and the integrity of every weld, seal, and system throughout the vessel. Shinano failed not because her basic design was flawed, but because her execution was fatally incomplete. Rushed construction, inadequate crew training, and insufficient testing created weaknesses that proved catastrophic when subjected to battle damage. For the American submarine force, the sinking validated their strategy of economic warfare against Japanese shipping and naval assets. A submarine costing a few $1,000,000 and manned by fewer than 100 sailors had destroyed a capital ship worth hundreds of millions and crewed by thousands. The mathematics of such exchanges were overwhelmingly favorable to the submarine force. The silent service had proven that it could strike anywhere, at any time, against any target the enemy could deploy. The age of the submarine as a true strategic weapon had fully arrived. Commander Enright's personal journey from failure to vindication resonated throughout the submarine community and the broader Navy. His story demonstrated that past failures need not define an officer's entire career, that persistence and courage could overcome previous disappointments and mistakes. He had faced his professional demons and emerged victorious through skill, determination, and perhaps a measure of good fortune. The Navy Cross he eventually received recognized not just his success in sinking Shinano, but his refusal to surrender after earlier setbacks. The human cost of the sinking continues to haunt the historical record. Over 1,400 Japanese sailors perished in the cold Pacific waters. Many were young conscripts who had never wanted to participate in war, but were caught up in events far beyond their control. They died trapped in flooding compartments, thrown from tilted decks, or abandoned in frigid water within sight of rescue ships. Their sacrifice achieved nothing of military value. Shinano never launched a single aircraft in combat, never defended the Japanese homeland, never justified the enormous resources devoted to her construction. Today, Shinano rests in 4,000 meters of water off Cape Omizaki. She lies inverted on the ocean floor, her flight deck buried in deep-sea sediment, her massive hull slowly collapsing under the relentless pressure of depth and time. She serves as both tomb for the men who died with her and monument to an age when nations believed that bigger invariably meant better, that one perfect weapon could change the course of entire wars. Modern naval strategists study her story as a cautionary tale about the limitations of the superweapon approach to military planning. In an era of nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and ballistic missile submarines, the fundamental lessons remain painfully relevant. Complexity requires competence to operate effectively. Size demands comprehensive support systems. No ship, regardless of her theoretical power, is stronger than the infrastructure that builds, maintains, and operates her. The sinking also illustrates the crucial role of chance and timing in warfare. Had Shinano sailed 24 hours earlier or later, had archerfish been assigned to patrol different waters, had the torpedoes run at their normal depth instead of the shallow setting Enright selected, history would have unfolded differently. War involves not just strategy and technology, but also luck, intuition, and split-second decisions made under extreme pressure. On that November night in 1944, all the variables aligned perfectly for archerfish and catastrophically for Shinano. The margin between victory and defeat proved razor-thin. In the decades following the war, the story of Shinano and archerfish evolved into legend within naval circles worldwide. Authors researched and wrote detailed accounts, historians analyzed every aspect of the engagement, and veterans from both sides shared their memories of that fateful night. Each retelling added new details, corrected previous errors, and built the comprehensive narrative that historians study today. The story became a case study in naval academies, a cautionary tale about preparation and training, and a reminder of warfare's unpredictable nature. Commander Enright continued his naval career after the war, eventually retiring with the rank of Rear Admiral. He rarely spoke publicly about the Shinano sinking, maintaining the quiet professionalism that characterized the submarine service throughout the Pacific War. When pressed for details about that November night, he would typically respond simply, "We did our duty. The torpedoes worked as designed. We were fortunate in our timing." But those who knew him understood that the victory meant everything to his sense of professional validation. The crew of archerfish maintained contact through annual reunions for many decades after the war. These gatherings brought together aging men who had once been young sailors, united by their shared moment of historical significance. They would recount stories of the long underwater chase, the tension of the final approach, and the satisfaction of hearing their torpedoes find their target. But they also remembered Shinano's crew, with the respect that one professional warrior shows another. War had made them temporary enemies. Time and perspective revealed them all as sailors who had served their nations according to their understanding of duty and honor. Some survivors of Shinano eventually shared their experiences after the veil of official secrecy was finally lifted decades later. They spoke of the chaos and terror during the sinking, the desperate struggle to escape flooding compartments, and the horrific sight of their mighty ship rolling over and disappearing beneath the waves. They remembered Captain Abe's final moments, standing at rigid attention as water rose around his feet on the bridge. They recalled shipmates who had helped others escape, who had given up their life jackets to injured comrades, who had pushed others toward safety before being pulled down themselves. In Japan, Shinano gradually became a symbol of the war's final phase, when grand gestures achieved nothing except additional suffering. She represented the danger of believing one's own propaganda, of confusing impressive appearance with actual combat effectiveness, of rushing toward catastrophe rather than acknowledging inevitable defeat. For America, the sinking reinforced democratic principles applied to naval warfare. 80 men in a submarine had defeated thousands in an aircraft carrier through superior preparation, training, and execution. It was a modern retelling of David versus Goliath, written in steel and explosives. The discovery of Shinano's wreck by deep-sea explorers in 2019 provided final confirmation of her fate. The images they transmitted from the ocean floor showed a ship that remained remarkably intact despite 7 decades underwater. Her battleship-grade construction had resisted pressures that would have crushed vessels built to lighter standards. But she lies forever inverted, her intended glory buried in the abyssal depths, serving as an eternal monument to ambition that exceeded capability and resources that were wasted on symbols rather than substance. Today, as nations again compete to build the largest and most powerful warships, Shinano's story retains its relevance as both warning and lesson. Technology advances at unprecedented rates, but the human factors that doomed her persist across generations and cultures. Ships are still occasionally rushed into service before comprehensive testing. Crews sometimes deploy without adequate training time. Leaders continue to believe that one supreme weapon can provide decisive advantage in complex conflicts. The ghost of Shinano warns against such hubris and overconfidence. Her story reminds us that in war, as in life, victory does not automatically favor the largest, strongest, or most heavily armed participant. Sometimes patience defeats raw power. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted through a single tactical error. Sometimes one night's action echoes through history, teaching lessons to generations not yet born about courage, preparation, and the thin line between triumph and disaster. On that cold November night in 1944, 2 ships encountered each other in the vast darkness of the Pacific Ocean. One was the largest aircraft carrier ever constructed by human hands. The other was an ordinary submarine with no particular claim to fame or distinction. When dawn broke over the empty sea, only one vessel remained above the waves. Such is the nature of warfare at sea: sudden, decisive, and absolutely final. The ocean shows no favoritism based on size, reputation, or national origin. It swallows all vessels equally, keeping their stories in the dark depths where Shinano rests still, the largest warship ever destroyed by submarine attack, a giant felled by a predator she never clearly saw approaching through the darkness.